Just because a black woman wore a uniform that didn't sit right with him, a white police officer aimed a gun directly at her head in the middle of a funeral, in front of the triangle-folded flag that had yet to be handed over. Without a single warning, without any justification, he drew his weapon, cold as steel, into the suffocating solemnity of the mourning ceremony. But what he didn't know was that this woman was the supreme commander of the Joint Special Forces, someone who held the power of life and death on battlefields in the Middle East. If even honor can be stared down at gunpoint, then does justice still exist where you live? The sky over Charleston was the color of worn steel, heavy and unmoving, as if morning had seeped into the weather itself. The American flag hung at half-mast, its corners limp in the still air, folded against the pole like it knew better than to try and flutter today. Rows of chairs faced a polished casket wrapped in ritual and silence, dark wood glinting faintly beneath the pale fabric of the ceremonial cloth. The casket was guarded by two Marines in white gloves in motionless stance, their faces carved into neutrality, eyes fixed forward. It was the funeral of a decorated black war veteran, a man with no surviving children, but a life long enough to leave behind ghosts. No hymns, no prayers yet, just the crisp creak of old boots on dry grass, the rustle of starched fabric, the uneasy quiet of men and women who had once followed orders, now trying to follow grief. The mourners sat upright in solemn rows, their uniforms buttoned to the neck, medals silent on their chests. A soft triangle of folded American flag rested atop the coffin like a verdict wrapped in cloth, its edges sharp enough to slice memory. A photograph of a young soldier, black, 20-something, alive and standing tall in riot gear during the Ferguson unrest, was propped against the base of the altar. Behind it stood a boy, no older than 7, dressed in a spotless white vest, his hands gripping a bouquet of lilies as if they might shield him from something just out of frame. No one knew his name, and no one asked. He didn't speak. His eyes never left the flag. Near the fence, a lone camera on a tripod blinked red once, then shut itself off. No one moved to fix it. Then she appeared. There was no sound before her, no footstep, no warning. Just a shift in the air, like pressure falling before a storm. She stood suddenly at the edge of the gathering, still, composed, in full navy blue ceremonial uniform. Her presence was precise, her posture was exact, her medals gleamed in disciplined alignment, and her nameplate, Patterson, caught the light like an accusation. The woman was tall, calm, and darker-skinned, her hair tucked beneath her cap in a coil of perfect regulation. No one recognized her. No one spoke her name, but she stood there like a cornerstone rediscovered. One by one, heads turned, but she didn't meet their eyes. Her gaze was locked on the coffin. From the perimeter, a man stepped slightly forward. Sheriff Travis Colburn, posted at the edge of the cemetery, rested one hand on his belt. His sunglasses masked his expression, but the way his jaw tensed beneath his mustache told more than words could. He was white, middle-aged and sunburned despite the clouds. His badge caught the light as he narrowed his eyes at the woman in uniform. His hand hovered inches from his sidearm, not drawing, not relaxed, as present, as if his authority had begun to itch under the weight of uncertainty. Patterson moved, one step, then another. Her boots made no sound. Her hands remained behind her back, clasped in the posture of military mourning. She walked past the rows of silent veterans, past the trembling fingers of the boy in white, past the folded flag on the coffin, and stopped. She looked down. The breath she took was small, like something remembered. Her lips did not move. But in that stillness, everything began to tighten. The Marines at the casket didn't shift. The wind refused to blow. Somewhere behind them, the camera light blinked once more, then blacked out completely. Colburn's posture stiffened. He took a step forward. It wasn't protocol, it wasn't curiosity, it was a challenge wrapped in authority. "Ma'am," he said, his voice steady but clipped. "I need to ask what your business is here." She did not respond. Her eyes remained fixed on the coffin. The sheriff's tone hardened. "This is a private ceremony. If you don't have family here, I'm going to have to ask you to leave." Still, she said nothing. The boy in the vest turned slowly, his bouquet shaking. His lips parted as if to speak, but nothing came. Patterson's gaze never wavered. Then Colburn did what no one expected. He took another step forward and reached out, his fingers brushing the metal on her chest as if to verify its reality. His thumb tapped the edge of her ribbon bar. Too familiar, too slow. Patterson's left hand rose, not to strike, not to defend, but to steady the badge above her heart, like something sacred might fall. The gesture was minimal, but the meaning echoed like a slammed door. Behind them, a man in a wheelchair shifted his weight. His name was Harris, a Vietnam veteran with one eye and both regrets. "You don't touch an officer like that," he growled, low, but no one listened. A second deputy moved quietly toward him, hand firm on Harris's shoulder, pressing him down. The creak of the wheelchair broke the silence like a back cracking. Harris didn't resist, but he didn't look away either. The camera, still dark, faced them like a blind eye. A crow landed on the nearest tombstone and cried once, sharp, too sharp, then silence again. Colburn leaned closer. "I asked you a question," he said, his voice now laced with something colder. "You don't look like you belong here." That sentence, as it left his mouth, settled like a stain on polished marble, every syllable laced with insinuation. Patterson didn't flinch. She inhaled once, her breath shallow and controlled. She looked up at last, not at Colburn, but toward the folded triangle of the flag. Her hand brushed the edge where the stars met stripes, straightening it without ceremony. Then she returned to silence. Colburn's fingers twitched near his belt, but he didn't move. Couldn't, wouldn't, not yet. One of the Marines shifted imperceptibly, as if sensing something was wrong, but their orders were clear. No disruptions, no interventions. From the edge of the crowd, the mother of the boy in white stepped forward and pulled her child gently behind her skirt. The boy dropped one lily. It landed on the grave like a punctuation mark. The camera blinked red once more and failed again. The sky grew darker, not from the weather, but from something else, a gathering, a judgment, the kind that didn't need thunder to feel real. In the background, the photo of the Ferguson soldier caught a draft and fluttered slightly in its frame. It showed him standing straight against the chaos of riot gear and tear gas. His expression was calm, focused, like he knew something others refused to believe. Patterson's gaze drifted for a second toward that image. Something flickered in her eyes. Not grief, not pain, but memory. A final gust lifted the flag slightly from the coffin. Patterson reached out and laid it back down. Her hand lingered just a second longer than it needed to. She pulled back. Colburn exhaled hard through his nose. Patterson didn't speak. She didn't need to. In that moment, surrounded by polished wood, rusted silence, and the faint stain of disrespect, she stood as if the weight of every funeral like this one had passed through her bones, and she carried it, quietly, entirely. The wind stopped. The air fell still again. This was not just a service. This was an intrusion. This was tension draped in formality. A sacred ritual was being watched by something that didn't belong, and everyone felt it, even those who didn't yet know her name. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. In that moment, surrounded by polished wood, rusted silence, and the faint stain of disrespect, she stood as if the weight of every funeral like this one had passed through her bones, and she carried it, quietly, entirely. Then the pause snapped. Sheriff Travis Colburn stepped forward with the arrogance of a man who believed his authority transcended ceremony. His boots crushed the grass with purpose, a sound too sharp for a place this sacred. "I'm going to ask one more time," he said, drawing out each word like he was issuing a verdict. "Identify yourself." There was no courtesy in his tone anymore, no restraint. His voice cut through the air like a rusted blade, dragging with it decades of rehearsed suspicion and institutional disdain. Patterson turned her head slowly. The motion was deliberate, almost surgical, like a warship adjusting course by inches. Her eyes, sharp and composed, met his, but her mouth remained still. The silence was no longer peaceful. It was command. In her stance was the kind of stillness only earned through war zones and tribunals. The stillness of someone who had seen men like him hold weapons and believe they held the world. Colburn smirked. It was a crooked thing, brittle and smug. "You don't look like you belong here," he said, loud enough for others to hear, his tone soaked in accusation masquerading as observation. The words hit the crowd like ash, subtle but choking. His hand hovered again at his belt, as if the threat of force could be worn like cologne. He took another step, too close now. "You armed?" he asked, though it wasn't a question. His hand extended toward her hip without waiting for consent. He touched the fabric of her uniform, brushing against the ceremonial sash and belt in a move that reeked of entitlement, not enforcement. It wasn't a security check. It was desecration, a violation, and worse, it was intentional. Patterson's hand didn't rise. Her breath didn't change, but the energy around her pulled tight, like the air itself was flinching. The crowd shifted, unsure if they were witnessing an arrest or an insult wrapped in protocol. From the second row, the wheelchair creaked again. Harris, the veteran, forced his withered hand up once more. "That's enough," he rasped. "Back off, Sheriff." But before he could finish, a younger officer stepped in, pressing hard on his shoulder and forcing him back into the seat with the kind of practiced control meant for criminals, not old men in medals. Harris winced, pain blooming on his face, but he didn't cry out. His eyes stayed on Patterson. She gave no signal, but he understood. Colburn leaned in closer, his breath sour with the confidence of someone who'd never been told no by someone who looked like her. "I don't see a rank. You sure you're not playing dress-up?" he hissed. The comment was venom, dipped in insinuation, designed to bruise without leaving fingerprints. It wasn't just an insult, it was a test. He wanted a reaction. Something loud, something emotional, something to validate the suspicion already loading in his holster. But Patterson didn't blink. Her gaze didn't move. Her restraint wasn't silence, it was sovereignty. It was a wall he couldn't climb. Behind them, the camera shutter clicked. Once, then again, the lens shook, not from wind, but from the hands of the photographer, a young freelancer who had come hoping to capture grief, not confrontation. But his gut told him this was going to matter, the kind of image that would outlive the people in it. His fingers hesitated over the shutter. He focused in tighter, capturing the proximity of the sheriff's hand, the press of his fingers against uniform fabric, the tension in Patterson's shoulders. Controlled, but unmistakable. The boy in white whimpered. His mother pulled him closer. Her eyes darted between the sheriff's hand and the badges on Patterson's chest, her expression tight with realization. Colburn sneered now, speaking under his breath. "You think that uniform makes you one of us?" His tone was low, oily, the kind of voice meant to remind someone of their place. "This isn't your stage. This is sacred ground." Still no answer, but Patterson's eyes, unblinking, pinned him in place. They said everything his training hadn't prepared him to hear. They were the gaze of command, of battles fought behind closed doors and banners carried where no reporters followed. It wasn't defiance, it was dominance, held still behind layers of controlled breath and folded hands. From the far corner of the cemetery, someone whispered, "Is he serious?" But no one moved. The Marines at the coffin held their pose, eyes fixed forward. They weren't statues, they were waiting. Colburn pressed his advantage. "If you won't identify, I'll have to assume you're a threat." He stepped back, one hand tapping his radio, but he didn't call it in. Not yet. He wanted to see if she'd break, but she didn't. It was Colburn who blinked first, and that blink was captured on camera. The photographer exhaled. He didn't know what he had yet, only that the footage felt heavy in his hands. It buzzed with consequence. Harris straightened in his wheelchair, defying the pressure of the deputy's hand still clamped on his shoulder. "You don't touch a soldier at a funeral," he said again, louder now. His voice cracked, but his words didn't. "Not unless you're burying them." Colburn turned toward him, lips tight, but didn't respond. The air shifted again, not wind, pressure. Every eye was now on them, not because they wanted a scene, but because they were in one. A breach of silence so profound it felt like desecration. Patterson took one breath. It filled the silence like a drumbeat. Then, at last, she spoke, not loud, not bitter, just 5 words, delivered with the weight of granite. "You're out of line, Sheriff." It wasn't a declaration, it was a judgment, and Travis Colburn, for the first time that morning, felt the chill of not being the one in control. The funeral had not begun, but the reckoning had. Colburn took a half-step back, his smirk wavering for the first time, not because of her words, but because of the silence that followed them. It wasn't empty, it was loaded. The kind of silence that reminded a man he'd crossed a line so long ago he couldn't see it anymore. Patterson didn't move. She didn't need to. Her stance was precision itself, forged not in arrogance, but in duty, and it unnerved him more than shouting ever could. The deputy beside Harris tightened his grip reflexively, unsure if the moment was unraveling or crystallizing. Harris's chest rose and fell with defiance, eyes locked on Colburn with the steadiness of someone who had buried brothers under the same flag, now being disrespected. "That's what they always do," Harris muttered, almost to himself. "Throw hands where they can't throw truth." Travis turned back toward Patterson, trying to reassert himself, his voice louder, too sharp now, a man pushing against a wall that wouldn't move. "This isn't a game," he snapped. "You walk in here like you own the place. No ID, no clearance, just medals pinned like they mean something, and expect us to stand down?" Patterson finally shifted, a step forward, measured, intentional. Her boots whispered against the grass. She raised her chin, her eyes never leaving his. "Medals aren't meant to prove anything to men like you," she said, each syllable clean and sharp. "They're reminders for the ones who survived." The photographer's hands shook again, tears welling without warning. He kept the shutter going, instinct overriding doubt. Frame after frame, his lens recorded not just confrontation, but conviction. Hers burning, his cracking. Colburn laughed, a single dry sound that cracked like a fault line. "You think silence and shiny clothes give you the right to be here?" His hand moved toward his holster again, not to draw, but to flex control. His fingers tapped against it, a rhythm of warning. Patterson stared at the gun, then slowly raised her eyes back to his face. "You carry that like a badge," she said, voice flat. "But all I see is fear." The boy in white cried louder now, his mother whispered, "Shh," rocking him gently, her gaze never leaving the scene in front of her. A man across the row whispered something into his sleeve, recording maybe, or praying. Colburn's face darkened, the kind of flush that comes from shame masquerading as rage. "I don't answer to theatrics," he spat, "and I sure as hell don't answer to you." The Marines still hadn't moved, but their eyes now were locked on the sheriff. No expression, but no longer neutral. "Then don't answer," Patterson said. "Just remember who was watching." It was a blow without motion, and it landed. The deputy loosened his hold on Harris, uncertainty creeping like fog across his spine. The camera, now back to recording, caught a close-up of Colburn's hand, twitching like it wanted to find safety but didn't know where. The photographer stepped slightly to the left, catching a new angle, one that framed Patterson's chest, her medals, her stance, against the looming aggression of the sheriff's badge and body. It looked like a mural waiting to be painted, a moment both still and screaming. The tension in the cemetery had become suffocating. The air thickened, heatless but heavy, every eye now turned not toward grief, but toward the spectacle of who would flinch next. Colburn narrowed his gaze. "Last warning," Patterson blinked once, slow and sure. "Then take your shot." He didn't, couldn't. Instead, he stepped back, just an inch. But it was enough for the weight of the moment to shift. In that heartbeat of retreat, the power flipped. She didn't smile, she didn't gloat. She simply stood, calm, unbroken, and watched him retreat inside his armor. Then, just as quietly, she turned back toward the coffin, adjusted the flag one final time, and stepped back into silence. This wasn't surrender. This was a reckoning survived, and every witness knew it. The shutter clicked one last time, a picture of the line, and who refused to cross it. As she stood by the casket once more, the silence resumed, not passive, but altered, carved into something heavier. The boy in white reached down, picked up a lily he had dropped, and approached her slowly. He said nothing, only offered the flower. She took it with a nod, knelt for just a breath, and placed it atop the flag. The gesture, small as it was, echoed louder than any command. Across the rows, people began to stand, not in protest, not in applause, but in solemn recognition. No orders, no cues, just a silent alignment, an acknowledgement that something profound had happened, something unspoken but undeniably clear. And Travis Colburn, jaw tight, arms locked at his sides, watched it unfold like a man finally realizing the storm wasn't outside him. It had always been inside, mirrored back in a woman who never had to raise her voice to win the war. She didn't look at him again. She didn't need to. The funeral would continue, but nothing would ever be the same. The funeral would continue, but nothing would ever be the same. And then, time cracked. Sheriff Travis Colburn moved with the jagged desperation of a man who had lost grip on his illusion of control. In a motion that was both reckless and rehearsed, his hand jerked toward his hip and withdrew his sidearm. The metal cleared the holster with a whisper that might have gone unnoticed on any other day, but here, in the cradle of silence wrapped around the dead, it rang like a bell toll. He raised the weapon. The barrel pointed directly at Patterson's head, and the world stopped breathing. The gasp that rippled through the crowd was silent, swallowed by a collective paralysis. A woman clutched her purse against her chest. A man's mouth fell open, but no words followed. Only the sound of a trigger being primed. The air thickened, not with wind nor smoke, but with something slower and far more ancient. Terror crawling into the lungs of everyone who stood to mourn, now forced to witness. The boy in white screamed, a sharp, high-pitched cry that sliced through the scene like glass. He dropped the lily he had offered and stumbled backward, burying his face into his mother's side as her hand instinctively shielded his eyes. Her lips moved in a whisper, pleading, praying, maybe both. Patterson did not flinch. She didn't raise her hands. She didn't speak. The gun was less than 3 feet from her face, the muzzle trembling with the fury of a man unhinged, of a badge-turned blade. Colburn's eyes were glass, no longer calculating, arrogant, just cracked. His finger curled, not fully, but enough that even the light seemed to back away. A young soldier on the outer edge of the gathering lunged, instinct overriding protocol. His boots pounded once against the ground before he was met by a different barrel. Another officer, faster, steadier, raising his weapon with clean, mechanical purpose. The soldier froze, hands up, caught between defense and death. Still, Patterson did not move. Her eyes, deep as stone and twice as heavy, remained locked on Colburn's. She wasn't challenging him. She wasn't bracing for the shot. Her stare was not one of defiance, but of disappointment. It bled no fear, only sorrow. And deeper than that, something more devastating. Recognition. Not of him, but of the moment, the inevitability of this. Her fingers moved slowly, so slowly they seemed not to move at all. They reached for the medal on her chest, the one bearing the insignia of her father, and held it in place. The clip had begun to loosen, dislodged in the earlier scuffle. She pressed it firmly against her uniform, keeping it from falling. Not out of sentiment, not out of panic, but as a gesture, a vow. No part of him would be desecrated further, not by this man, not by this moment. A breeze shifted, brushing the grass in faint patterns. Somewhere behind them, a bird flapped and lifted from a branch, its wings the only thing moving freely. The gun remained still. Patterson did not. Her shoulders rose with a breath so subtle it might have gone unseen if not for the perfect stillness of her form. Her lips parted slightly. Not to speak, but to breathe, just once. Just enough to remain human in the face of what no one should be forced to endure. Colburn's hand tightened. His lips twitched. His voice, when it came, was hoarse and hollow. "Move," he whispered. It was not a command. It was not a plea. It was confusion, helplessness, and hateful in the same breath. He wanted her to flinch, to tremble, to beg, but she didn't. So the question became not what he was stopping, but what he had already become. The sun, muted behind the clouds, cast no shadow. Time, for a moment, belonged only to them. Then something gave, a breath, a blink. The creak of Harris's wheelchair as the old veteran tried to shift forward again. veins in his neck straining against restraint. The younger deputy held him back, knuckles white, unsure whether he was holding him down or himself together. The photographer hadn't moved. His lens captured frame after frame, each one identical in composition yet louder in meaning. The line of the gun. The face of a woman is unbroken. The crowd was frozen in the echo of nearly, and Patterson unmoved. In her silence was thunder, in her stillness an earthquake. Her right hand still pressed the insignia to her chest. Her left, clenched just behind her back, remained unshaken. Her jaw was set. Her eyes, glassy but unblinking, showed not vengeance, but legacy. Colburn breathed through his teeth, face slick with sweat. He adjusted his grip, more to regain purpose than precision. Then Patterson blinked. Once, slow, like drawing a curtain across history. The gun did not fire, but something in him broke. The moment didn't end. It dissolved, like ice collapsing into water. The tension held a heartbeat longer, then fell like ash. Colburn's arm, still raised, trembled. Patterson lowered her hand from her chest, the insignia secure, and took one step backward. Not retreat, not surrender. A ceremonial reclaiming of space. The sound of the boy's sobs filled the silence. Harris was no longer being held. The photographer stepped back, blinking away tears behind the lens. Travis Colburn, gun still outstretched, stood alone in his certainty. And Patterson, still not saying a word, held more power in her breath than he did in all the noise he had left. Someone coughed. Not loud, just a dry sound in the wake of thunder, a throat clearing itself of fear. The kind of cough that happens when your body remembers how to breathe after forgetting. It echoed louder than it should have, bouncing off tombstones and uniforms, off trembling shoulders and locked jaws. Colburn lowered the gun, slowly, without intent, as if gravity had finally done what reason couldn't. His fingers released the grip in increments, his joints stiff like rusted hinges. He didn't holster it, he just let it hover by his side, dead weight in a dead moment. The silence was thick again, but different now, no longer tension, no longer pause, but fallout, reverberation, the kind of silence that follows something irreversible. Patterson turned slightly, just her body angling toward the casket. Her eyes had not left him, not even for a blink. Now they did. Now she looked down, at the flag she had straightened, in the photo of the soldier, at the honor nearly desecrated. Her hands came together in front. No flourish, no authority in posture, only finality. A posture not of surrender, but of memory. The young soldier who had nearly intervened remained frozen. The gun pointed at him had been lowered too, but the moment hadn't released him yet. His lips moved as if whispering to himself, something between Jesus and don't. No one heard clearly. It didn't matter. Colburn wiped his forehead with the back of his hand, eyes darting, not toward Patterson anymore, but around, measuring. Who had seen? Who had recorded? Who would remember? The answers were in the silence, in the unmoving camera. The boy is still crying. In the woman with lilies, now crushed under her shoes. In Harris, now sitting tall, hands folded, like a judge. Patterson bent slightly, retrieving the photo that had shifted on the coffin's edge. She dusted it off, not with gentleness, but with duty. She repositioned it at the center of the wreaths and stepped back into line. Not her line, the line of every funeral like this one, of every uniform that had ever stood between a country and its conscience. The photographer took one last frame, then lowered his camera. His fingers were cramped, his knuckles white, his heart loud in his chest. He didn't know yet what the photos would mean, only that they were no longer images. They were evidence. Colburn finally holstered his weapon. The snap of leather broke the spell. No one clapped. No one moved forward. Patterson stood there, not as a victor, not as a martyr, but as a marker of restraint, of control, of the line that had almost been crossed. Her eyes lifted again, but not toward Travis, not anymore. She looked upward, where the sky had begun to clear just slightly. A shift in the clouds, a slit of light, not hope, not redemption, just clarity. Then she walked back to her place among the mourners, and the funeral resumed, but not the same. Nothing was the same. Later, no one would agree on exactly how long that moment lasted. Some said it was seconds. Others swore it stretched across lifetimes, but everyone remembered how it felt, like standing inside a lightning bolt that never struck but split the sky anyway. Travis Colburn didn't look at Patterson again. He couldn't. His gaze dropped to the dirt beneath his feet, as if it might offer him an exit or an excuse. But there was none. Not now. Not here. He adjusted his badge as though it might anchor him, but the metal felt colder than before, less like a shield, more like a chain. Patterson, for her part, never spoke another word. Her silence wasn't empty. It was complete. The kind of silence that doesn't ask for justice because it knows it already carries truth. When she took her place again by the casket, those around her shifted slightly to make room, not because she needed it, but because she had earned it. A hush had settled over the gathering, not of fear, but of reckoning. The child in white no longer cried, but his small hand gripped his mother's sleeve with the weight of 1,000 funerals. She looked down at him, then toward Patterson, and nodded. Not a greeting, but a gesture of allegiance from one witness to another. Across the line of mourners, eyes followed the woman in navy. No one said her name aloud. No one had to. She was the reason they would remember the day, not for death, but for dignity defied and restored in the breath between bullets. The camera remained where it had been, its light off now, but no longer broke. It had captured enough. The story was already told, not in words, not yet, but in looks, in breaths, in the slow descent of a weapon never fired. From his wheelchair, Harris exhaled deeply. Not relief, but recognition. He had seen war before. He had seen cowards in uniform and heroes in silence. He knew which one had stood before them today. And as the minister finally stepped forward, voice trembling, and began the first lines of prayer, no one interrupted, not even Travis Colburn, especially not him. The service went on. The wind returned. The boy's lily, now bruised, lay beneath the chair where Patterson had stood. It did not need to be lifted. Its message had already bloomed. The prayer had just begun, but the world wasn't ready for silence. As the minister's voice trembled through the first verse, something pierced the hush. Not a gunshot, not a siren, but a voice that cut cleaner than both. "That's General Patterson," someone shouted, the syllables bright and shattering. The voice belonged to a Marine, young but battle-worn, standing near the back of the mourners, his face twisted with the realization, the kind that shakes loose everything you think you know about rank, order, and who's owed respect. Heads turned. Breaths halted mid-inhale. It wasn't just what he said, it was how he said it, like confession, like gospel. Another voice echoed after his, then another. "It's her! That's her, General Patterson!" One by one the ripples became a wave. The gathering of veterans, soldiers, and civilians began to murmur, then speak, then proclaim. The name hit the air like fire catching dry brush. Patterson didn't move. She didn't need to. The recognition burst around her like sunlight finally cracking through after a hurricane. But her body stayed composed, arms folded at her front, gaze steady on the casket. Her silence, again, was not absence, it was dignity. Travis Colburn turned slowly, like someone emerging from a nightmare into a worse truth. His face was bloodless, his lips parted, soundless at first, then forming a single phrase that dropped like a stone into still water. "She doesn't look like—" He didn't finish. He couldn't, because by then the crowd had already started shifting, not away from Patterson, but toward her, as if drawn to the gravity she had so calmly concealed. A woman in civilian clothes stepped forward, her hands trembling. "I served under her in Kandahar," she whispered. Not for drama, but because her throat tightened with certainty. "She saved my unit." A young man with the distinct tattoo of a seal on his forearm nodded toward Patterson. "She briefed our op, 22 days in hostile territory, and she walked us through every one of them like it was arithmetic." Someone else pulled out their phone, not to call, not to post, but to stream. The camera captured Patterson's face now in full, framed by medals glinting against the still navy of her uniform, each one a testament that didn't need to be defended, only noticed. The live stream caught fire. Someone zoomed in on the ribbons on her chest. An online viewer traced the bars, matched them against military records. Another viewer in a comment thread confirmed her division command. Then a tweet exploded, showing a blown-up screenshot of her nameplate glinting beneath a layer of sun and dust. Patterson. Below it, 6 rows of commendations, 3 of them rare enough to make headlines. The internet didn't just verify her, it unveiled her. On phones held in trembling hands, her dossier unfolded in real time. Combat records, leadership citations, formal photographs once buried in restricted files. The thread, titled General Patterson's Real Time, climbed trending ranks within minutes. Within 15 minutes, it had crossed into mainstream media cycles. The hashtags were instantaneous. General Patterson. She led. Salute real. And still, she said nothing. Her face, now clearly visible on live streams, was etched with something heavier than pride. It wasn't vindication. It wasn't relief. It was something deeper, an exhaustion too old for her age. The quiet ache of someone who had been carrying truth so long it no longer surprised her to be disbelieved. Her eyes were dark, not just in color, but in weight. A soldier's stare. The look of someone who had watched decisions turn to blood and still stood anyway. Colburn stammered. No, someone would have said something. A veteran near the front stepped forward, pointing directly at Patterson's chest. Those medals don't lie. That's a Distinguished Service Cross. That's a Silver Star. That's a Navy Cross. His voice didn't rise, but it cut. You don't wear those without knowing their weight. The man's words became punctuation marks. Click. Live stream. Share. Click. Screenshot. Tweet. Travis looked around. No one was backing him up. Even his deputy had lowered his gaze. There was no room for doubt anymore, only the kind of silence that arrives too late to save you. And Patterson? Still silent, still steady, but now every eye belonged to her, every lens pointed at her, every doubt melted by the sheer force of undeniable fact. The truth hadn't just arrived, it had detonated. A veteran in Army greens, his chest cluttered with medals dulled by years but not forgotten, stepped forward next. His voice was gravelly and gritty. She pulled me out of Sangan Valley. My unit was left for dead. She airlifted us herself. Another confirmed. She was the one who rewrote ROE protocols after the Task Force Theta ambush. Nobody talked about it, but every field officer knew who she was. Their stories weren't shouted. They didn't need to be. They were solid. Earned, reverent. Phones shook in trembling fingers as the live viewer count climbed past 500,000. A slow zoom on Patterson's chest revealed the 6-inch gold bar of a theater commander, a distinction fewer than 15 people in uniform had earned since the Iraq drawdown. A former DoD analyst tweeted a screenshot. General Arian Patterson, awarded 2019 Distinguished Joint Leadership Citation, Kandahar Command. Verified. That tweet hit 1 million impressions in 4 minutes. Meanwhile, Patterson didn't blink. She breathed. She stood. She watched, not with triumph, not with demand, but with the gaze of someone who had expected to be forgotten and found herself instead remembered. Her body language said none of this was new to her, only to them. Colburn staggered back 2 steps, mouth dry. You mean to tell me I almost... He stopped himself. Too late. The truth now hung around his neck like a badge dipped in tar. A woman holding a toddler turned and glared at him. You pointed a gun at a flag, she said. That wasn't a mistake. That was who you were. Her words hit like a verdict. Uncoached, unfiltered, unmissable. The toddler reached for her necklace. Patterson's face reflected in the charm. Another man pulled out an old, folded photograph from his wallet. She trained my daughter. Top of her class. He held it up to the camera. The resemblance was immediate. Same posture, same eyes. The minister had stopped reading scripture. His hands were trembling now. Not from fear, but from knowing this funeral had become history. No longer a burial. A reckoning. A drone shot from a media crew buzzed in the distance, the red light blinking, capturing the aerial spread of the crowd converging around Patterson like planets to a fixed sun. The image would go viral in under 30 minutes. It would be studied in classrooms. And Travis Colburn, he stood alone, the noise fading behind him. No rank to hide behind, no weapon to justify. Just the realization of what it meant to misjudge someone whose power didn't require permission to exist. Patterson looked forward. Her eyes moved past the phones, past the whispers, past the shock. She bent gently, picked up the lily the boy had dropped earlier, and placed it against the casket's side. She adjusted the corner of the flag once more. Her fingers never shook. The camera zoomed in on that movement. It would later be called the most graceful act of command in 21st century military history. No orders, no words. Just absolute command of presence. The caption that spread the fastest didn't come from news anchors or politicians. It came from a 17-year-old viewer watching the live stream in Detroit. It simply read, "She didn't say a word. She didn't have to." The whole damn country saluted her anyway. In the background, the flag rustled. It wasn't the wind. It was a memory coming home. By now, the story was already out of Charleston's hands. National feeds had cut from scheduled coverage to live streams. Commentators scrambled for context, some reading hastily from military dossiers they'd never expected to need. Studio lights dimmed under the weight of unprepared awe. "We're receiving confirmation," one anchor said breathlessly, "that the woman involved in the Charleston incident is indeed General Ariane Patterson, one of the highest-ranking officers in recent U.S. operations abroad." But the real confirmation didn't come from headlines. It came from silence. It came from every veteran in that cemetery who stood a little straighter, not because they were told, but because they knew. Because leadership, true leadership, doesn't require ceremony. It radiates. One Marine, maybe 30, maybe younger, stepped forward from the crowd. He didn't speak. He saluted. Clean, sharp, textbook perfect. Others followed. The Army, Navy, Air Force, civilian contractors. One by one, in different states of dress and age, they raised their hands to their brows and held it. The salute was not demanded. It was returned. Colburn was still frozen, hands at his sides, the spotlight no longer hid. He looked down at the dirt again, like it might hide him. His earlier words echoed back louder now. "She doesn't look like," and yet she was. She did. More than he could ever be. Patterson acknowledged none of it. She stood, not in the light, but in her gravity. The scene wasn't about her, it never had been. It was about what had been almost lost, what had been doubted, what had finally, irrevocably, been seen. The young Marine lowered his salute, eyes wet. "Ma'am," he said softly, the only word he spoke. She nodded once, slow and certain. A new wave of posts hit the net, this time with images from the scene, angled from ground level, from overhead, from live stream thumbnails. Every post carried one message. She stood. They followed. Inside the chapel, the church bell rang once. Patterson didn't speak. She didn't need to. She had already been heard. And in that stillness, the truth was no longer questioned. It was standing tall, uniform pressed, eyes forward. It was saluted long after the last prayer was spoken, long after the boy in white had been led away by his mother, and even after the media vans cleared from the gravel path beyond the fence. One final frame lingered. Patterson alone, back straight, eyes set on a horizon no camera could catch. Her presence did not fade with the crowd. It expanded into memory, into history, into the fiber of a story no longer whispered behind closed ranks, but spoken aloud by a nation waking up to what it nearly ignored. The last photo taken that day would win an award, but it was never about the image. It was about the truth behind it. And truth, once named, never goes unseen again. It didn't take hours. It didn't even take one. 30 minutes after the last salute, the internet had exploded. The footage, shaky at first, taken from a phone tilted slightly too high, caught the tension. Not the words, not the full exchange, but the raw, unfiltered pressure of a gun raised toward a uniform that didn't flinch. It spread not because of the clarity of the scene, but because of what it suggested, that something sacred had been violated, and someone had stood still in the face of it. The first post came from a military spouse, then from a war journalist, then from a cousin of the boy in white. Each one added a caption. No voiceover, no edits, just the tag, gun at honor. By the time the clock hit half past the hour, the hashtag was top 3 in the country. 15 minutes later, it was number 1. In tandem, another tag surged up the ranks. General Patterson. Unlike the other, this one didn't burn with outrage. It rose with reverence. It became a movement. The videos weren't edited, but they were enhanced. Slowed down, cropped in, stabilized. A film student in Austin posted a clip that zoomed in on Patterson's eyes as the gun leveled with her skull. There was no panic, just weight, just sorrow, just command. His caption, "That's not fear, that's honor under fire." It went viral within minutes. Major news outlets picked up the trend, reluctantly at first, but as the views skyrocketed, 2.7 million in under an hour, they scrambled to catch up. CNN aired a 10-second loop without comment. MSNBC brought in a military historian to decode the metal rose. Fox News tried to cut in with the question of procedure abuse, but the panelist shook her head live on air and said, "I've deployed 7 times. That woman outranks the question." Comment sections fractured instantly. One side called Patterson a symbol of silent strength. The other questioned why she didn't immediately identify herself, as if military decorum demanded permission slips to exist. Some comments veered uglier. "She doesn't belong at that kind of funeral. This is why tradition is under attack." Was this even real? The replies were swift and unforgiving. "I served in Fallujah. I'd follow her through hell. She's a better American than half this thread. I don't care what you believe. She stood, that's all." But it wasn't just veterans or activists. Celebrities reposted the zoomed-in still frame. Politicians tried to frame the moment into sound bites. Influencers stitched their faces beside hers, crying, narrating, turning solidarity into algorithmic momentum. The most watched variant of the video didn't include any narration. It simply repeated the moment of stillness, gun drawn, Patterson unmoved, with a superimposed heartbeat and a single line fading in over the last frame. "She stood," he pointed. By the end of the day, the video had 34.2 million views, and the country was no longer talking about a funeral, it was talking about a reckoning. Veterans forums lit up like battlefield comms. One post under a thread titled "The Line That Held" read simply, "I've pointed a rifle at the Taliban, at insurgents, at men who'd kill for ideology. Never would I point it at a comrade in uniform. Not even in hell." That quote became its meme, copy-pasted over images of Patterson's profile, layered with a subtle flag overlay and shared across Reddit, Twitter, and TikTok like gospel in JPEG form. Then came the pushback. Right-wing echo chambers seized on the clip, not to disprove it, no one could, but to reframe it. Was this infiltration? They asked. A political stunt? One pundit on a conservative network called it an unauthorized presence at a white veterans memorial, and others followed. They couldn't say the word black. They didn't have to. The subtext choked the air. One op-ed, anonymous but widely shared, claimed this is what happens when you politicize mourning. Our sacred spaces are no longer safe. The backlash was swift and ugly. Screenshots of alt-right chat logs surfaced, labeling Patterson a uniformed threat and calling for ceremonial purity. But the responses came louder, sharper. "She is the ceremony," one reply snapped. "Your problem isn't that she showed up, it's that she didn't kneel to you." A group of veterans stitched together footage of Patterson standing, with background overlays of Medal of Honor citations. The final clip ended with the words, "If you'd point a gun at her, you'd point a gun at us." Within 24 hours, a dozen digital billboards from Atlanta to Seattle had lit up with that same frame. Patterson, still as stone, a gun inches from her, eyes unshaken, captioned only with "Stand with honor" or "Stand down." Journalists scrambled to keep pace. Think pieces filled every digital corner. What does a hero look like now? Read one. The uniform isn't what you think it is, another. Every photo of Patterson turned into a symbol, a weapon, a mirror. For some, she was defiance made flesh. For others, she was a disruption. The country was no longer simply watching. It was choosing sides. A university professor on a morning talk show called it an unplanned referendum on perception, power and protocol. His co-hosts blinked. He continued, "We saw a decorated general in full-dress uniform, and because she didn't fit the visual mythology, we questioned her right to exist within the frame." The quote circled LinkedIn, then Medium, then grad school syllabi. Meanwhile, students began printing Patterson's photo on stickers, on coffee shop walls, dorm room doors, guitar cases, laptops. The same face stared outward, stoic, steady, refusing to blink. A counterculture hero not because she broke rules, but because she obeyed them better than those who questioned her right to be there. The visual storytelling student from earlier remixed his zoomed-in eye clip into a short 30-second film. No sound, just black and white, slow-motion frames, first the gun, then her eye, then stillness, then a fade to black. The final text, "What if strength was never loud?" It got picked up by a Cannes student showcase within 48 hours. In a corner of rural Texas, a retired sniper posted a TikTok from his shed. He didn't cry. He didn't yell. He just stared into the lens and said, "My hand shook more watching that clip than it ever did on a rooftop in Baghdad. If you don't understand why, maybe you're the one who never should have worn the badge." It amassed 5 million views, and yet Patterson herself remained silent. No statement, no tweet, no press, only the frame remained. The moment, the weight, and the world spun around it. Reporters chased family, combed archives, and called Pentagon offices. Most were turned away or given one-line statements. But somewhere in a thread on a forgotten message board, someone posted, "She knew what she carried, and she knew we'd have to look at it eventually." It was no longer a video, it was history in rotation, and the internet, for once, didn't scroll past. In Washington, aides debated whether to prepare a statement, not about Patterson, no one dared, but about the incident, the visuals, the backlash. Internally, they called it the frame problem, because that's what it had become. One still frame, more damning and defining than any press conference could repair. "We've had soldiers disrespected before," one strategist whispered off record, "but never a general, in full colors, on camera, in front of a..." Memes evolved into manifestos, threads into essays. Every culture blog, defense magazine, and academic think tank had something to say. "This wasn't just a moment of disrespect," one editorial opened. "It was a mirror held up to the rot that still stains the stars on our flag." Meanwhile, school teachers used the footage as discussion prompts. Middle schoolers asked why the man pointed the gun. High schoolers debated silence as a protest. One civics class in Ohio wrote letters to Patterson. They didn't know where to send them. They mailed them to Arlington anyway. The pressure reached Congress. A junior senator from Illinois tweeted, "You salute a general. You don't interrogate one." The post went viral, then got ratioed by a retired major who replied, "You don't wait until they wear stars to believe them." Even international media picked it up. French broadcasters called it a l'image qui édifie l'Amérique. In Tokyo, news anchors replayed the clip side by side with ceremonial footage from Japanese defense honors, noting the universal weight of stillness under threat. And still, Patterson remained absent. Not invisible, her presence was now unavoidable, but absent by choice. A refusal to comment became its doctrine, as if to say, if you didn't listen when it mattered, you don't deserve the story now. By the end of the week, the original video had been translated into 14 languages, and the gun in the frame had become less a weapon and more a wound the country couldn't stop tracing. Some said it was just a clip, a glitch in tradition, but for millions, it was the moment the silence finally stared back. The silence that followed was not absence, it was calculation. Inside the Pentagon, doors closed with that heavy sound of policy about to shift. Not publicly, not yet, but something in the building had changed. Not in the way halls were walked or uniforms were pressed, but in the way eyes met across briefings, a stillness, a subtle reevaluation, respect recalibrated. A closed session was convened on the 4th floor, where windows were thick and cameras were not permitted. Around the table, no one raised their voice. They didn't need to. The projection screen held a freeze frame, Travis Colburn's weapon drawn, Patterson standing still. The room was sterile, but the air bristled. One general, white-haired, 3 stars pressed crisp against his collar, stared at the screen longer than most. His words, when they came, were low, deliberate. "If it had been me," he said, "he'd be on his knees by now." The footage had already been dissected. Military intelligence had requested every body cam, drone angle, live stream segment, and even civilian footage uploaded to social media. Nothing was spared. The composite review came back with a noticeable void. 6 minutes of missing data from Travis's issued body camera. 6 precise, uninterrupted minutes, the moment leading up to the confrontation and the moments just after. An omission that spoke louder than anything it could have shown. Internal Affairs red-flagged the deletion immediately. The report didn't speculate. It didn't need to. An analyst from the Department of Defense quietly annotated the file with a one-line comment: "Chain of custody, compromised, recommend escalation." That line traveled, not in headlines, in inboxes, across secure channels, between names that didn't ask who Patterson was, only what else had been erased. Elsewhere in the building, an internal memo circulated among senior officers, marked as confidential, but leaking was a form of tactical protest now. It outlined the optics risk. A decorated general, publicly dishonored, weaponized under the flag she swore to defend. A PR colonel noted in red ink, "We do not control the narrative. The narrative now controls us." Meanwhile, something stranger happened in the field. SEALs posted photos. Not of missions, of memory. Quiet uploads appeared across verified accounts. Men in desert camo, arms around a woman in navy dress blues. Patterson. No captions, just coordinates and year. Afghanistan 2012, Syria 2015. Each image was another nail in the coffin of plausible ignorance. Airborne Rangers followed. Marines. Black and white stills of briefings, mid-air extractions, combat shadows. One clip resurfaced of a sandstorm in Helmand, blurred but unmistakable. Patterson yelling into a headset, covered in dust and purpose. A lieutenant colonel retweeted it with a single sentence: "She got us all out." This wasn't sentiment, it was testimony. Digital and deliberate. In private, the Joint Chiefs were split, not about Patterson, her record was beyond dispute, but about precedent. What would it mean if they said nothing? If the image of a gun drawn on a general in full regalia became a footnote and not a fulcrum? One admiral spoke first. "We say nothing, it becomes acceptable." Another followed. "We speak now, it becomes policy." At Fort Bragg, a group of junior officers started a letter, then thousands signed it. An open petition began, addressed not to Colburn or even his department, but directly to Congress. It was short, blunt: a decorated general deserves protection from friendly fire. By day 3, a copy of the footage had been officially entered into the congressional record. The Department of the Navy issued a non-statement which only fueled the fire. It read, "We continue to evaluate all matters of inter-service conduct and support ongoing investigations." By the time the press finished parsing that sentence, it had been buried beneath a wave of testimonials, not accusations. A retired brigadier general, African-American, wheelchair-bound but mentally sharp as command steel, published a short essay in The Atlantic. Title, "Why She Didn't Flinch." In it, he wrote, "She stood because she has always stood. When I met her, she was the first to show up and the last to speak, unless it mattered. That day it mattered. It was shared 2.4 million times in 48 hours. Behind closed doors, review boards sharpened. The footage of Travis Colburn was reconstructed as fully as possible. His missing 6 minutes were being scoured, not just for content, but for motive. Why delete? Who knew? Who helped? He had been suspended pending inquiry, but the badge on his desk felt more like a souvenir than a shield. Meanwhile, Patterson's command record became public domain. Against her will. Scanned PDFs appeared on military Reddit threads and defense journalist feeds. Pages of commendations, tactical field reports, letters of thanks from allies. A combat medic's handwritten note read, "General P pulled me out after I was hit. She didn't wait for orders. She made them." The White House refused to comment. The Army's Inspector General opened a quiet side investigation, and still, Patterson said nothing. Her silence echoed louder than any headline. By day 5, the silence cracked. Not from Patterson, but from the public architecture of defense. A senator from Vermont, a former Army Ranger, stood on the Senate floor and read the names of those who'd served under Patterson. It took him 41 minutes. He finished with a single line. None of them ever raised a weapon to her. That honor belongs only to a civilian in uniform. The Pentagon released a second statement, this time not drafted by comms. It acknowledged the footage, the deletion, and the inappropriate escalation of force against a senior active duty officer during a ceremonial observance. It stopped short of an apology, but it was no longer neutral. Around bases, a quiet movement swelled. On every desk where a flag stood, one more item appeared, a printed still of Patterson. Some placed it in frames. Some laminated it. Others simply pinned it beside the Constitution's first page. Outside Quantico, cadets marched in silence for 2 miles. No signs, no slogans, just uniformity in defiance of erasure. When asked why, one replied, "Because we don't raise arms at Legacy. We stand beside it." Digital Ops reported attempted hacks on military records. Unsuccessful, but telling. Someone wanted Patterson's history gone. Instead, it multiplied. Her training videos resurfaced, her mission briefings, clips of her in cold rooms walking rookies through combat ethics. One instructor said, "She wasn't teaching tactics. She was teaching what it means to carry a country." A third internal leak revealed the phrase circulating among Joint Command, Operational Reverence Protocol. No formal briefing yet, but it was clear they weren't going to forget, because if they did, the silence would. And this time, silence was wearing stars. The question was no longer about guilt, it was about culture. What kind of system produces a moment like this? What kind of training allows someone to aim without hesitation at the embodiment of service? In a classified ethics briefing circulated to senior NCOs, a bullet point was highlighted 3 times. Command presence is not race-bound. The protocol must reflect that truth. At West Point, a chalk message appeared on a stone wall. "Don't salute prejudice." It was scrubbed within an hour, photographed within 30 seconds, shared 10,000 times. A retired Major General wrote a letter to the Secretary of Defense. It was 1 page. It read, "She wore the stars. The stars did not wear her. You don't repair this with time. You repair it with clarity." And clarity was coming, not in the form of press releases or court rulings, but in the quiet systems that outlive news cycles. Policy drafts circulated, training modules adjusted, a new scenario added to military VR simulators. Respect Response Protocol, Code Uniform v. Civilian Conflict. The avatar standing still, even in code, was modeled after Patterson. On the 7th day, a quiet message appeared on an internal Joint Task Force newsletter. It wasn't official, it wasn't signed, but it sat in bold, unread by few and remembered by all. If one of us must stand alone to remind the rest what honor is, so be it. But next time, we'd better be standing with her. It was over 1,800 words now, but for the military, it was only the beginning. The 7th day didn't bring silence, it brought names. Travis Colburn was the first, but not the only one to surface. A thread began, not by journalists, but by former colleagues, military watchdogs, and quiet whistleblowers with receipts. What had begun as questions of protocol unraveled into something far older and far more deliberate. It began with a voice recording, short, blurred by static, but unmistakable. "You can't expect a dark-skinned girl to give orders to men with bloodlines," the voice crackled. "Not in my county, not in my unit. I don't care what stripe she's got." The voice was verified. Travis Colburn. Date stamped 2 years prior, recorded by a colleague during a closed-door briefing that never made it to official records. The colleague remained anonymous, but the source was authenticated through multiple filters. It was real, it was him, it was recorded in uniform. That leak opened the door. Within hours, internal reports surfaced, disciplinary notices filed, then ignored. One cited incident from 2019 detailed Colburn refusing to acknowledge a field promotion earned by a black female deputy. The reason given in his handwriting, "She lacks command, authority, and appearance." The report was closed after a verbal clarification. More followed. A former training cadet came forward on TikTok, face shadowed but voice steady. I remember him mocking my accent. Told me I was lucky they didn't make us march separately like it was 1942. I laughed then because I didn't want to lose rank, but it never left me. That video hit 6.3 million views. Reddit exploded with timelines, screenshots of past complaints, archived officer evaluations. One document dated back 5 years, a field misconduct report, alleging Travis told another deputy that nobody with slant eyes gets to call plays in my town. None of it had made national attention before, but it had happened, all of it. The trail didn't stop at statements. A retired sergeant major posted a scanned letter, an internal memo from 2020 showing Travis had been counseled for conduct unbecoming after refusing to escort a visiting officer of Vietnamese descent. The note scribbled in the margin, "Cultural friction. Will monitor." It had been signed, filed, and forgotten. Until now. Then came the training footage. An archived video from a rural sheriff's workshop showed Travis demonstrating an urban de-escalation tactic. He used slurs, veiled as jokes. Laughter followed, nervous but present. The facilitator offered no pushback. One participant later commented anonymously, "We thought he was exaggerating. Now I think he wasn't." By day 3, the press caught up to what the internet had already documented. A Washington Post piece titled "The Sheriff's Shadow" mapped Colburn's misconduct across 5 years, cross-referencing local complaints, body cam audit gaps, and racial disparity in citations under his watch. The patterns were mathematical. His arrests skewed 72% toward people of color. His internal promotions, 94% white. Then came the testimonies. A former black deputy, "He told me straight, 'You'll get farther if you smile more and lead less.' I quit after 6 months." A Latina traffic officer, "He changed my schedule every week so I'd miss my kids' daycare. When I asked why, he said, 'Maybe try harder to blend in.'" A Korean-American analyst, "He wouldn't let me speak at a briefing because he said my cadence made people uncomfortable. That was my first week, and my last." None of these voices were public before. Now they were unrelenting, not poetic, just precise, fact after fact. No apology followed. Just silence, this time from Colburn's camp. Internal watchdogs reopened cases that had once been deemed inconclusive. One flagged entry, a 2018 physical altercation between Colburn and a reservist. The reason? The reservist wore a Black Lives Matter pin to a charity drive. According to the report, Colburn shoved the man into a wall and called him an embarrassment to the uniform. No charges filed. The incident had been marked and formally resolved. Digital sleuths uncovered a court deposition from a discrimination lawsuit that had been quietly settled out of court. It included a transcript where Travis allegedly told a subordinate that real Americans don't need diversity briefings, they already lead. The case had vanished from public radar, but in this new context, it rang like a confession. Then, an old training log surfaced from his academy days. Not digital, scanned, in pencil. A note under peer assessments. Colburn displays extreme confidence bordering on disdain, especially toward minority instructors. Recommends an independent review. That review never happened. And still, he advanced, promoted, protected. A pattern emerged. One, not of accident, but of design. The people who documented, who raised flags, who expressed concern, they'd either left, retired, or gone quiet. The ones who stayed, they had learned the system's favorite lesson. Some uniforms are stitched in Kevlar, others in camouflage. A final leak landed like a missile. Audio, again, but longer this time. A full 5-minute clip of Colburn talking after a staff meeting. His voice is casual, unaware. "I don't take orders from people who got here on affirmative action. I take orders from men who earned their bloodlines." That line tore through platforms. screenshots, quotes, dossiers, and then silence again. But this silence felt different. It wasn't an absence, it was a shame. Colburn's department issued a brief statement. "We take all allegations seriously and are cooperating with oversight bodies." It was the kind of sentence built to say nothing, but it no longer mattered. Public trust had bled out faster than any PR tourniquet could bind. Civil rights attorneys compiled the digital archive of misconduct into a single file, 87 pages, 42 entries, 17 affidavits, 9 direct witnesses, and over a dozen independent confirmations. They submitted it to both the State Ethics Board and the DOJ. The title of the submission read, "Pattern of Prejudice in Command Authority, F. Sheriff Colburn." But legal bodies weren't the only ones building files. The public had its memory now. At a small community college in Michigan, a sociology class held a mock hearing. The students read transcripts from Colburn's leaked audio. They compared them to recruitment materials. They listed contradictions. One freshman said, "If this is the kind of guy who polices patriotism, I'm not sure what country he thinks he's protecting." Cable news ran timelines. Podcasts dropped breakdowns. One investigative series was titled simply, "The Sheriff of Stains." Its tagline, "He pointed a gun at honor. Let's point a spotlight on his record." Travis Colburn did not speak publicly, but former classmates did. A Navy corpsman remembered him in a dorm rec room, joking that the only reason women of color joined the military was so they could finally outrank their fathers. Another classmate recalled him celebrating after a disciplinary board exonerated him. He said, "This country still knows how to protect the right kind of men." That line became its indictment. It was printed on protest signs, not because it was shocking, but because it wasn't. No one could pretend anymore. The truth wasn't hidden. It had just never been believed, until now. The internet didn't just remember, it indexed. Users created a Colburn file, an interactive database where each entry could be filtered by year, location, severity, and departmental response. It wasn't built by any government, but by coders, archivists, and activists. Not a case study, a cautionary tale. One is embedded in every browser tab of those paying attention. Protesters began marching not with chants, but with silence. They carried signs with QR codes linking directly to the statements of deputies he had targeted, to the handwritten forms marked "No Further Action." They wore uniforms, replicas of Patterson's dress blues, but without insignia, just a patch that read, "Respect is not requested, it is required." At police training centers, recruits whispered his name not in admiration, but as a warning. Instructors who once dismissed bias training have now started each session with the same phrase. Command begins with restraint. A clip of that line began circulating with side-by-side footage of Colburn's arm extending and Patterson's stillness absorbing it. A journalist asked a former commander, off the record, why Colburn had never been flagged. He answered with a shrug. He was useful until he wasn't. That shrug did more damage than any leaked memo. It told the truth. Colburn's racism had not survived in secret. It had survived in structure, and that structure now had fingerprints all over it. Fingerprints from supervisors who signed off, peers who looked away, and boards who called repeated bias a lapse in temperament. In the end, Colburn was not an aberration. He was the reflection of what was tolerated. No one said this out loud, but the public had learned to read silence like a transcript, and every blank line now read complicit. When the final audit report was released, tucked beneath pages of legalese and procedural review, it included a single italicized line from the Oversight Committee. "The presence of a badge does not erase the presence of bias." That quote was never read aloud at any press conference, but someone had engraved it into a plaque and placed it outside the academy that Colburn once graduated from. No ribbon cutting, no cameras. Just metal and silence and truth, and beneath it, in smaller font, "No one will say the system failed. They'll say it was busy protecting its own." It began not with an apology, but with a spotlight. Travis Colburn's face flickered across national television, tight-lipped, underlit, framed by a network studio like he was about to sell a memoir instead of answer for a near felony. His voice had lost none of its barbed edge, but it carried something now that hadn't been there before: calculation disguised as contrition. "I was afraid," he said, staring past the camera. "I didn't know who she was. I acted on instinct. Training. We were told to respond to unknown threats." The interviewer blinked slowly. She was in full uniform. Travis didn't flinch. "Uniforms can be faked. It's not hard. But you drew a weapon at a funeral. I understand how that looked, but in the moment, all I saw was an unknown presence near a high-profile gathering. I didn't see the rank. I didn't see race." The silence after that was louder than any siren. Online, the quote trended immediately. "Didn't see rank, didn't see race." It was clipped, memed, and skewered. One veteran tweeted, "Funny, I saw both. From my couch." Through a cracked screen. A panelist on another network, retired Navy JAG, responded live. "You don't need to see rank. You recognize it, and if you can't, you don't belong in uniform." Colburn's legal team released a statement minutes after the interview aired. It leaned heavily on language like perceived threat, breakdown in situational awareness, and regret for any distress caused. No mention of Patterson, not by name, not by rank, not even by gender. It was as if she were still invisible, but she wasn't. She just hadn't said a word, yet her silence filled every room he entered. The studio that aired Colburn's interview issued no comment, but its audience did. Within an hour, the network's social feed was flooded, not with outrage, but with scorn. I didn't see rank become the refrain of ridicule, sewn onto shirts, quoted in parody sketches, etched into protest signs in dry black ink. A former military court prosecutor appeared on a rival channel the next morning. His delivery was crisp, clipped, and final. More than a flea, his delivery was crisp, clipped, and instinct, he said, is not a defense when it contradicts regulation. The minute you draw a weapon, your training is no longer behind you, it's in front of you, and it's what you just ignored. Still, Colburn doubled down. A second clip emerged, filmed from a more casual setting. A dim room, books behind him, jacket off, tie loosened, as if vulnerability could be staged. "I don't blame people for being upset," he said. "But I just reacted. Everyone wants to make it about race. But in the moment, I didn't see color. I saw someone I didn't recognize." That line ignited another firestorm. A sergeant major posted, "It's always about race when the person you didn't recognize has more stars than your entire precinct." Another response went viral. "Funny how you didn't see her, but we all saw you." A clip from a congressional hearing began circulating the same day. A military legal advisor leaned into his mic and said, "A funeral is not a war zone. A flag-draped casket is not covered, and a general is not a threat unless you've decided they shouldn't exist." The gallery behind him stood silent, because no rebuttal was needed. Colburn's words had done all the damage themselves. Meanwhile, a conservative senator took the chamber floor. He stood, brow furrowed, voice steeled in false balance. "Are we now criminalizing fear?" he asked. "Are we willing to sacrifice protocol on the altar of public outrage? I say no one should be destroyed for hesitation." That clip, too, made the rounds, but not the way he hoped. A veteran responded, "Hesitation didn't pull the trigger. His certainty did." In a military podcast hosted by 3 retired officers, one of them paused mid-discussion and said, "We used to train for ambiguity. Now we're excusing incompetence." That's a dangerous line to blur, and all the while, Patterson remained unseen, not silent because she couldn't speak, silent because she had already been heard. Her stillness now loomed so large that every defense mounted in Colburn's name collapsed under its weight. In the weeks that followed, a civil forum was held on national ethics in command recognition. Scholars, officers, and diplomats sat in rows and debated not the legality of what had happened, but the culture that made it possible. A historian summarized it best. "This isn't about one drawn gun. It's about decades of permissions whispered in boardrooms and locker rooms and patrol cars saying, 'You'll be fine so long as they stay quiet.' And they were. until they weren't. The retired judge put it plainer still. We're not watching a trial, we're watching a reckoning. Colburn attempted a final media appearance, scripted, softened. If I could go back, I'd wait. I'd ask, but I didn't know. I didn't know what I was looking at. The moderator didn't blink. That was a general. You didn't need to know. You needed to respect. There was no comeback. The final word didn't come from Patterson. It came from absence. She declined every interview. She issued no statement. She stood once at a ceremony, not for herself, but for another fallen soldier, and left before the cameras could turn, but her image remained. And in every room where Colburn's voice echoed, her silence outlasted it. Journalists called it a strategy. Advisors called it discipline. Veterans called it the command. But everyone else knew she had already said everything worth saying by not saying a word. A magazine cover ran her photo half in shadow with the caption, "The General Who Let the Country Speak First." It sold out in hours. Meanwhile, Colburn's likeness became a symbol too, though not the one he hoped. His quotes appeared in law school mock trials, listed under failed rationale. His name became a case study in military academies. Perception versus protocol, the Patterson precedent. One final panel aired. A former Marine, eyes sharp, said, "She didn't silence him, he did. He opened his mouth and the whole world saw who he was. Meanwhile, she just stood." That phrase landed like steel. She just stood. Not a slogan, not a protest, a fact. Colburn was placed on administrative leave pending further investigation, but the real sentence had already been passed by public memory, by professional consensus, and by the contrast he created. A man who needed to speak to be believed, and a woman who didn't need to speak at all, because truth, when it wears a uniform, doesn't beg for recognition, it commands it, even from silence. Elsewhere, a high school civics class in Delaware ran a debate titled "The Value of Knowing." One student argued, "Ignorance isn't innocence when power is involved." Another responded, "You don't get to say, 'I didn't know' with a badge and a weapon." Their teacher asked a final question, would the outcome have changed if he had known? A pause. Then someone whispered, "If he needed to know to respect her, he shouldn't have worn the badge in the first place." That clip surfaced online, became part of a viral teaching series. The comment section overflowed, not with politics, but with reflection. "My dad served under her. My aunt saluted her once. She never forgot it. I showed my kid the clip. She asked me why the man was yelling at the lady in uniform. I couldn't answer." In a quiet corner of a legal symposium, a former military ethicist addressed a panel on command recognition failure. Colburn's defense wasn't that he acted in fear, she said. It was that his fear excused his action. That's not accountability. That's the architecture of prejudice. Back in Patterson's hometown, a mural began to appear, brushstroke by brushstroke. It wasn't heroic, it was restrained, a side profile, uniform pressed, medals detailed, no face shown, just posture. Under it, 4 words: "She didn't need permission." Colburn, meanwhile, faded, not disappeared, but decayed in public view. Every new appearance chipped away at his image, not because of opposition, but because of exposure. His words kept circling back to him, each one louder in contradiction, each one failing to hold. And Patterson remained as she had from the beginning, dignified, distant, unbending, a figure not elevated by sympathy but by stature. She didn't answer his statements. She didn't challenge his framing, because the truth once shown doesn't need a stage. It only needs to stand, and she had, without permission, without apology, without a single wasted word. On the 8th week after the funeral, a university in Georgia hosted a public exhibition titled "Power, Perception, and Silence." At its center was a looping installation, 2 screens side by side. On one, Colburn's interview paused at the moment he said, "I didn't see rank." On the other hand, a slow-motion clip of Patterson's stillness as the gun was leveled at her. A plaque beneath read, "One man explained, one woman endured." Visitors walked through the space slowly. A father paused with his son. "What did she say after?" the boy asked. The father just looked at the screen. She didn't have to. Outside, students placed candles beneath a stone display with engraved words from the Military Code of Justice. Not a protest, not a campaign, a reminder that dignity isn't volume, it's gravity, and gravity, once present, bends every word around it. Later that month, a final document leaked, an internal review from the Department of Defense. One sentence buried deep in its third appendix. Command deference must never depend on visual affirmation. A protocol exists to protect the rank from prejudice. That line was never quoted in the press, but someone had carved it into the underside of a bench at Arlington. A quiet bench, facing east, facing forward. Where truth doesn't shout, it stands. Weeks passed. No statement, no memoir, no interview. But one day, in a quiet act no camera captured live, Patterson visited the small military archive where her father's original commission had been framed. She brought nothing with her. She asked for nothing. She simply stood before the document for 17 minutes, then left a single envelope on the desk. Inside was a printout of the Military Justice Clause about conduct at ceremonial grounds, highlighted. Beneath it, her handwriting, small and precise. The rank isn't for recognition, it's for protection. The archivist posted the image online. It traveled without needing a hashtag. No caption could heighten it. No thread could outrun it. The message was clear. She hadn't just refused to respond. She had answered, and the country, for once, knew how to listen. Some truths don't wait for permission to be believed. They just wait for silence to get out of their way. And when it came, the silence was the verdict. Her eyes didn't accuse, didn't forgive. They simply reminded everyone, you knew better. The roads into Charleston didn't close. They waited. At first, the townspeople thought it was another ceremony, maybe a convoy rerouting through old parade routes. But it didn't sound like that. It didn't feel like that. No sirens. No drums, no announcements, just the slow rumble of military tires meeting worn asphalt, the weight of something heavier than steel pressing into every mile. Line after line of armored vehicles moved like a tide held back by reverence. Each one bore no flags, no branch insignias, no tactical displays, just silence, and on every front bumper, mounted where unit tags would normally sit, was a single printed still, the frame of Patterson standing at attention with a gun aimed at her temple, uncropped, unapologetic, a moment immortalized not to stir anger, but to stain denial. The convoy stretched for blocks. SEAL teams, Rangers, airborne, retired officers, logistics corps, nurses, clerks, chaplains. No orders, no central command. Just a decision shared across factions and generations. We do not march for her. We march because of her. At the rear of the line, a decommissioned transport truck painted matte black rolled slower than the rest. On its side, painted in white military stencil font, "We bury honor, not silence." And below that, not names, but dates. Each one marked the day a statement wasn't made, an apology wasn't offered, and an injustice wasn't corrected. They weren't demands, they were tombstones. Spectators gathered as the sound grew. No chants, no signs, just the hush of collective recognition. One child clutched their parent's sleeve and whispered, "Are they mad?" The parent shook their head. They remember. And Charleston held its breath. The sun overhead did not blaze. It loomed, gray-filtered behind low clouds, like a lid kept just tight enough to keep every breath heavy. The streets didn't cheer. They didn't need to. People came out not to support or protest, but to bear witness. Phones were raised, not to perform, but to remember. Documenting without hashtags, posting without slogans, just image after image of a procession that spoke without sound. Soldiers inside the vehicles wore their dress uniforms, not pressed for ceremony, creased for clarity. Each chest bore a single black sash crossing left to right, the diagonal of grief worn not over the heart, but through it. No medals, no ribbons, only the weight of presence. In every windshield reflection, the same face repeated, Patterson's. Frozen in that moment, unmoved, unblinking, unbroken. As the convoy turned down Meeting Street, the sound changed. Not louder, more precise. The tires slowed as if responding to the density of memory. This wasn't where Patterson was born. It wasn't where she trained. But it was where the country realized what it had tried not to see. That mattered more. A group of white protesters had gathered ahead, signs lifted with phrases like, "Honor the right uniform," and "Don't twist the narrative." Their voices tried to slice the silence, but nothing answered. No jeers, no tension, just the still gaze of hundreds of men and women in uniform, standing curbside, saluting, heads turned not to the flag, but to the convoy. The protesters shouted louder. One threw a crumpled pamphlet at the hood of a Humvee. It was not touched. It was not returned. It was left to curl in the wind and collapse into the gutter water. The vehicle rolled on, and the crowd, watching, never moved. No one clapped. No one waved flags. And still it was the most deafening procession Charleston had seen in a generation. Every block they passed became a corridor of reflection. On balconies, elderly veterans stood at attention, spines straightened by something older than pain. On porches, children held photos their parents had printed, images of Patterson, not in command, but in stillness. On truck bore no image, only a pane of glass where a windshield should be, and behind it an empty uniform hung as if someone had just stepped away. The crowd didn't ask who it belonged to. They already knew. And in that knowledge was an ache deeper than loss, recognition. At a corner near the old courthouse, a group of cadets from a local ROTC chapter stood in silence. They didn't march, they didn't move, but they wore small black armbands and watched with the intensity of those learning not from lectures, but from example. Someone dropped a megaphone in the distance. It cracked against the ground, feedback screeching once before dying. No one turned to look. The final vehicle approached slowly, the one with the message that had already circled the internet 1,000 times. "We bury honor, not silence." As it rolled past the city's central square, someone had written in chalk on the pavement beneath it, "But silence remembers everything." That line wasn't part of any campaign. It wasn't sponsored, but it stayed. The chalk held up through the wind, through the rain, and when it finally faded, the imprint remained. Charleston didn't forget, and it never would. As the convoy disappeared down the last avenue, the city did not exhale. It held its breath, like reverence, like guilt, like awe. What had passed through Charleston was not protest, not ceremony, but consequence. There were no medals distributed, no honors conferred, and yet every window facing that road became a mirror. People didn't ask, "What did she do?" They asked, "What did we let happen?" In neighborhoods miles from the route, old radios replayed the coverage, though few spoke. They listened, not to commentary, but to the absence of it, because every reporter learned quickly that no voice could match the weight of what had just moved past. Cameras focused on boots that never touched the ground, shoulders that didn't twitch, faces set to neutral like carved monuments. And then there were the signs, posters, gestures. A cafe turned off its music for the day. A school reads the Constitution aloud at morning assembly. A church bell rang once, then remained still. It was not mourning. It was not a celebration. It was a collective reckoning. In the days after, the route was retraced in quiet walks. People carried flowers, not for Patterson, for the idea of what she stood for, that the uniform was not hers alone to bear, and that silence, when held with dignity, could shape policy, change culture, redefine command. A journalist from New York wrote, "They marched without noise, but history shouted back." And in Charleston, they left the roads unwashed for a week, not out of negligence, out of respect, so the tracks could stay visible a little longer. 7 days later, someone taped a photo of the final truck to the City Hall door. Below it, a single sentence typed in courier font. "We no longer salute in silence. We stand in it." No one claimed authorship. But no one took it down either. Across the country, other cities began organizing their silent tributes. No directives, no speeches, just movement. San Diego, Norfolk, Minneapolis. A convoy in Atlanta rolled through midnight, headlights off, hazard lights blinking once every 10 seconds like a measured heartbeat. In each place, a photo of Patterson led the line, not to glorify her, but to remind everyone who was left standing when others reached for weapons instead of recognition. In Charleston, a sculpture commission was quietly approved. It wouldn't be grand, no pedestal, just a metal frame of a figure in uniform, hands at her sides, eyes level with yours. On the base, no name, no dates, only 3 words etched in military precision. Still, she stood, and that was enough. Years from now, some may forget the convoy. Others may misremember the order of trucks, the way the light slanted across their windshields. But no one would forget the silence, the way it moved, the way it refused to be provoked or redirected, the way it made every accusation dissolve, every defense ring hollow. Because this was never about volume, it was about truth. And in Charleston, that truth marched without needing to speak, without needing to stop. Weeks later, at a small military installation in North Dakota, a young private requested to change his oath ceremony date. When asked why, he answered, "I want to take it on the day she stood." No clarification was needed. The request was granted. In an officer training module revised that same month, one scenario stood out. A silent encounter, no dialogue, only body language. A trainee was asked to react to a civilian in uniform at a military funeral. The correct answer wasn't a command, it was a gesture. Step aside, acknowledge, let them pass. Across the screen, the answer printed slowly, "Respect does not need confirmation to be owed." A quiet documentary aired late one Sunday evening. No narration, only archival footage of the convoy through Charleston, Patterson's service record scrolling at the bottom in stark font. It closed with a shot of the inscription on the sculpture's base, "Still she stood," followed by 30 seconds of silence. The network received more letters about that silence than any line ever spoken. And in the Pentagon, a wall once reserved for portraits of decorated commanders added a new frame, no face, just a shadow outline of a woman in uniform, weapon trained on her from the side. Beneath, in embossed steel, Charleston, Day of Stillness. It wasn't meant to honor her. It was meant to remind them all what happens when they forget who they're saluting and who they've failed to. In the heart of the city, near the route where the convoy had passed, someone hung an unframed canvas on a brick wall. On it, only brushstrokes, dark, wide, silent. No signatures. Just the faint outline of a line of trucks beneath a storm-heavy sky. No faces, no slogans, no guns. Just the feeling that something had moved through that space, something that couldn't be captured in news or memory or command. Every few days, someone added something small to the mural. A pressed medal, a black ribbon, a scrap of a funeral program. No one organized it, no one explained it, and no one took anything away. Eventually, someone wrote in chalk below it, "If silence marches, who listens?" And someone else answered below that, "Those who were never meant to survive it." No one erased it. No one spoke. They just looked and kept looking. Because in Charleston, they no longer questioned the silence. They stood with it. And this time, they didn't look away. And so, the last salute wasn't a raised hand, but a city's stillness. Not a goodbye, a vow that no silence, once broken, would ever be asked to stand alone again. No orders were given, no banners flown, but the lesson stayed. Silence, when carried with honor, could march farther than any battalion and leave behind a trail that even history dared not rewrite. It was not the silence that lingered, it was what followed it. After the procession vanished from Charleston's streets, after the roads were cleared but never scrubbed, after the last uniform faded into memory and the sculpture stood alone under a haze-lit sky, Patterson returned, quietly. No cameras, no podium, just her and a folded paper in her hand. The funeral home had kept his coffin in a side chapel. away from the noise and bustle of the ceremony. It wasn't for show, it was for closure. The man inside wasn't just a father. He had been her compass when the world handed her nothing but chains. She remembered the day they met, not in a courtroom, but in the shadow of one. She had been shackled, 17, head down, future already labeled in juvenile ink. He had seen her not as a file or a risk, but as a recruit the world had overlooked, a soldier with no rank but full potential. The room was small, wood-paneled, lit by the kind of stained glass that softened pain but didn't erase it. Beside the casket, placed with the precision only old soldiers knew, was a black-and-white photo, Patterson in cadet fatigues, saluting beside him. Her chin was awkwardly raised. His hand was steady. Between them, a flag that now lay folded on the lid in a perfect triangle. She didn't cry. She didn't blink. She placed the envelope next to his medals. Inside, only a sentence. "You were the first person who didn't ask me to prove I belonged." Then she opened the old ammo box he'd left for her, and the room, without saying a word, remembered everything. Inside the ammo box, time had been folded with more care than ordnance. There was no weapon, no rusted steel, only the weight of memory made tangible. A copy of her first field report, marked in the margins in his blunt handwriting. "You lead from silence, not from volume." A small tin badge from when she made sergeant. A photograph neither of them had ever spoken about. Her in fatigues, standing between two men in suits, unsmiling, fists clenched, just outside a courtroom. And beneath it all, a cloth-wrapped medal, the Navy and Marine Corps Commendation Medal. Bronze star at its center, ribbon faded from sun and salt. Attached, a yellowed slip of paper, his handwriting again. "They gave this to me after Da Nang. I give it to you for surviving the day before that." She held it without reverence, just recognition. This was not a gift, it was a passing of record. Not valor earned in war, but honor carved from survival. The air in the room didn't stir, but the light through the stained glass darkened slightly, like even the morning had lowered its voice. From the corner the faintest note began to rise, not mechanical, not piped through speakers, but played, live, from a wooden flute. Someone in the hallway, someone who knew what was about to be felt but couldn't be spoken. The first notes of taps didn't echo. They settled. Each tone fell like a goodbye withheld too long. She didn't salute. She didn't move. She stood again. And for the second time in a week, the world knew better than to interrupt her silence. After the final note hung and vanished into the grain of the chapel's wooden walls, Patterson stepped closer to the coffin, her shadow crossing over the flag like an unspoken pledge. She ran her fingers along the edge, not to steady herself, but to trace the line between who she had been and who he had helped her become. Her hand stopped near the seam where the lid met the body, and, for a breathless moment, she considered lifting it. Not to see him, she didn't need to, but to say goodbye to something older. Instead, she reached into her coat pocket and removed a second item, a worn corner of military parchment, sealed in plastic, creased at the fold lines, his last handwritten letter, not addressed to her, but saved by her all the same. Its ink is still legible, though time has softened its confidence. If that day comes, and your silence weighs more than your voice, hold it. Let them fill the space with questions they cannot answer. She laid it gently atop the flag. Outside the chapel, a breeze caught the edge of the stained glass light and fractured it across the floor. Slivers of gold and red shimmered over her boots, over the box, over the past. She didn't look down. The door behind her creaked open. She didn't turn, because the only thing left to say had already been said, by a father who didn't raise his voice, only his daughter. When she finally turned, it wasn't to leave. It was to take one last inventory, not of belongings, but of meaning. The photo of them saluting, the folded flag, the commendation he'd passed down like a will carved into bronze. The flute's lingering echo still clings faintly to the archway. Nothing here needed to be explained. Everything here had been earned. On the way out, she paused before the chapel's guest book. Still open, still blank. She picked up the pen, didn't sign her name. Instead, she wrote one word on the first line, "Pre." It was how he'd taught her to answer roll call. Not here, not yes, just that. Present, meaning whole. Accounted for, unashamed. In the lobby, an old man waited with his hat in his hands. Navy wool, pressed decades ago, still holding shape. He didn't speak. He nodded once. She nodded back. Nothing more was needed. His name tag read Samuels. His wrist bore the faded tattoo of a unit long since disbanded. He stepped aside as she passed, then walked into the chapel alone. Patterson exited through the side corridor, the one they used for family. Her boots echoed softly down the marble. No click, no pace. Just the sound of someone moving without hurry, without need to prove anything anymore. At the exit, sunlight hit her face, and she didn't flinch. That, too, was something he gave her, the ability to walk forward knowing she owed the world nothing, but it would remember everything she gave it anyway. Later that evening, she returned to the base where his personal effects had been kept. No escort, no staff, just a key and a code he had memorized, not for security but for symbolism. Inside the small locker were 3 items: his journal, bound in cracked leather, an unopened bottle of bourbon labeled for the end, not the middle, and a cassette recorder, decades old, with a single tape inside marked simply, "For her." She didn't play it there. She waited until night. Back in the guest quarters, where the hum of silence didn't compete with grief, she pressed play. The tape crackled. Then his voice emerged, slower than memory, gentler than legacy. He didn't tell stories. He told her what no one else ever had. That leadership wasn't about control. That silence wasn't about submission. That the loudest thing he'd ever done was step between her and the system that would have erased her. He ended with, "If they ever ask what I left you, tell them I left her standing." She stopped the tape, not because it hurt, because it landed. She sat for a long time. No medals on her chest, no salutes on her back, just the memory of a man who saw her before she knew she could be seen, and the certainty that standing wasn't what he taught her, it was what he proved was possible. The next morning, before anyone else was awake, Patterson walked the perimeter of the base alone. She wasn't inspecting. She was remembering. At the south fence, near the faded plaque listing retired commanders, she stopped. The name of her father wasn't listed. He'd never commanded troops in the field, never outranked the majors, but he'd commanded something else: belief. She pulled from her coat a small brass plate, etched, clean, deliberate, silent. It read, "Instructor of Honor." She screwed it into the bottom corner of the plaque, beneath the last name, not replacing, but adding, completing, then stepped back and saluted. The wind picked up, not strong, but enough to make the flag nearby lean just slightly toward her. It fluttered once, then stilled, and she turned away. Somewhere behind her, the morning drills began. Boots striking concrete in sync, orders barked in clipped syllables, the machinery of military rhythm returning. But for a few more steps, she walked in silence, and the silence didn't just follow, it cleared the path. That night, she stood once more at his gravesite. No ceremony, no wreaths, just her boots on the soil he now returned to. She lit no candle, carried no photograph. Only the folded flag was still clutched to her chest, and under the breath of wind she whispered something only he would have understood. "I didn't speak because you taught me how not to. I stood because you showed me where to stand." And for the first time since the gun, the crowd, the silence, the weight, she exhaled. Not in grief, in gratitude, because everything she had carried, he had once lifted, and now it was her turn to hold it high. Not for him, because of him. In the weeks that followed, no headlines mentioned him. No speeches quoted him, but quietly his presence began to echo. A young recruit asked why a brass plate had been added to the old commander's wall. The drill sergeant just said, "Because someone had to remind us what we forgot." A chaplain wrote in his ledger, "There was no sermon that day, but something was preached." And in the officers' mess, someone left a photocopy of his letter on the bulletin board. No name, no source, just the words, "If your silence weighs more than your voice, hold it. It stayed there long after the tape yellowed, long after newer directives covered it, but no one ever removed it. At the end of that month, during a twilight training run, Patterson passed the parade ground alone. The wind had shifted, the sky had cleared, and in that perfect moment of breathless dusk, she felt it not his voice, not his touch, but the shape of his belief around her, like armor that didn't clink or shine, but made her impossible to break. She didn't smile. She didn't cry. She simply placed her hand over the place where her badge used to be and kept moving forward. Because that, too, was how he'd taught her to lead. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. Legacy was already walking beside her. In the stillness that followed, nothing rose. Not applause, not orders. Just footsteps on gravel. The sound of command without command. The echo of earned quiet. Legacy didn't end at a grave. It stepped into rooms with no windows and air so still it measured guilt. Travis Colburn found himself in such a room, not arrested, not warned, simply retrieved, lifted from his desk at the county precinct by two men in dark suits who didn't flash badges and didn't raise voices. One held a folder, the other held the door. They said his name once, not a question, just the sound of it. He followed, not because he had to, but because he understood too late that not following was no longer an option. The room they brought him to was neither sterile nor chaotic. It was clinical in its clarity. Single table, 3 chairs, no clock. Fluorescents that buzzed but didn't flicker. On the table, a single manila folder stamped confidential, joint forces, in a faded block font. Beside it, a glass of water. No one told him he could drink. The taller of the two men sat first. He didn't open the folder. He didn't introduce himself. He said only, "Do you know what this is?" He tapped the cover once. It made no sound. Travis didn't respond. The other man spoke, slower, calmer, and colder. "You drew a weapon on someone who once commanded 3 strike teams during Operation Ashdagger, who briefed NATO on coordinated satellite surveillance, who negotiated the Kandahar Unification Corridor with 4 joint national forces. You didn't point your gun at a threat. You pointed it at the key to the Eastern security grid, and then they let the silence do the rest." Travis opened his mouth, but nothing coherent followed. His throat had dried to sand. The sweat hadn't reached his shirt yet, but it would. One of the agents finally opened the folder, not to confront him, but to flip slowly through pages he couldn't see. The paper sounded crisp, deliberate, a language of its own, no authorization, no probable cause, no chain of command. The man's voice didn't rise, and yet you deployed lethal posture in a ceremonial space. He slid a single page across the table without looking up. A photograph. Patterson's face in mid-turn, the pistol visible in the periphery, her eyes not wide in fear, but locked in something colder. "Calculate," the agent continued. "She didn't flinch, because she knew your weapon was as empty as your authority." Travis blinked, too fast, too often. His hands twitched in place. "I didn't know who she was," he muttered. The second man tilted his head. "That's not a defense. That's a confession." They said nothing else for 5 full minutes. Just the sound of the fan overhead clicking once every 30 seconds. The kind of rhythm that breaks people without ever raising a hand. Then the taller agent leaned back, folded his arms. "Do you know who I am?" Travis didn't answer. "I served under her. Kandahar, Task Unit Echo. When she said hold, we didn't move. When she said go, we cleared the map. She didn't need to prove her rank. Her presence made the decision." He stood. No dramatics, just gravity. He pointed a gun at that, and suddenly the walls felt closer. Travis's breath caught in his chest, the kind of half-drawn inhale that never finds an exit. His eyes flicked to the exit door, but no part of his body dared follow. There was no yelling, no threat, but there was judgment. Quiet, clinical, total. The taller agent remained standing, folding his hands behind his back. He didn't pace. He didn't tower. He simply stood like someone who had stood before war and knew the difference between chaos and cowardice. "Let's make something very clear," the seated agent said, finally breaking the standoff with a tone colder than process. "You weren't a sheriff in that moment. You weren't a man defending civilians. You were a citizen with a badge. attempting to dismantle the chain of deterrence. You thought you saw a threat, but what you saw was something else. A woman who outranked your comprehension. Travis's lips moved, but the words didn't commit. She didn't look like. That's your second confession, the taller one replied, still calm. You mistook a uniformed officer for a challenge, and instead of thinking, you drew. They pushed another page toward him. It wasn't a report, it was a list. These are the names of every operative she's commanded or protected. Some are alive because she made a call. Some aren't because she had to. The list was long, classified, and marked with the clearance code Tier 4, restricted eyes only. Travis stared at it but didn't dare touch it. Now, the agent continued, tell us what made you think you had the authority to measure her worth. And again, silence was the loudest answer in the room. The room didn't grow colder. Travis did. Something inside him retreated, not from shame, but from exposure. He was not a man crumbling. He was a man caught. And that distinction burned. It wasn't personal, he mumbled, the line brittle as glass. I reacted on instinct. The shorter agent raised one eyebrow. You mean bias? No, Travis barked, too loud, too fast, then quieter. No, you reacted to what you refused to recognize, and in doing so you exposed more than your failure. You exposed the fragility of the uniform you claimed to defend. They let that sit. The folder closed. Not snapped shut, just gently pressed like a priest folding a holy book. The seated agent looked directly at Travis now, his words slow and precise. You are not here for punishment, not yet. You are here because the system you embarrassed is still deciding whether to cleanse itself with you or without you. Travis leaned back. His chair didn't squeak. His pride did. The taller man approached, placed both palms on the table, not leaning in, just grounding truth where it could no longer be escaped. She hasn't filed charges. She hasn't spoken a word against you. And yet, half the armed forces have already decided you don't belong in their ranks, in their sight, or in their memory. Travis looked down. The taller man pushed away from the table, stepping back with the gravity of a closing verdict. Do you know what silence like hers means, officer? He asked. Then, after a pause, it means she's not aiming at you. Yet, that was when Travis truly understood what fear without volume felt like. The interrogation ended not with dismissal, but with a door that opened on its own. The agents didn't tell him to leave. They didn't stand to escort him out. They merely turned away, one reviewing notes, the other sipping water. It was not an exit, it was a surrender on his part. Travis stood, legs unsure, mouth opening for a final plea that never came. No words could rebalance the scale. No apology would mend a fracture this precise. He walked out, not knowing if he was free or if he'd simply been released into a different kind of custody. One carried not in handcuffs, but in consequence. Outside, the hallway stretched long and dim. No signs, no guards, only fluorescent lighting that buzzed like a verdict whispered through miles of wire. As he passed a corner mirror, he caught his reflection. Unshaven, eyes red, his badge now looking like a borrowed thing he hadn't earned. Somewhere behind him, a voice finally spoke, not to him, but to the room he had left. He needs memory. Then silence returned, and the door clicked shut without echo, and Patterson, miles away, said nothing still. She didn't have to, because some truths outrank testimony, and some silence salutes itself. Hours later, Travis sat alone in his parked car just outside the precinct. He hadn't gone in, couldn't. The badge on his dashboard no longer looked like protection. It looked like provocation. Officers passed by outside, some nodding, most not. One paused, glanced at him through the windshield, and moved on without acknowledgement. That was worse than a confrontation. It was erasure. He finally stepped out, adjusting his belt by instinct, though it no longer grounded him. Inside, the chatter dimmed slightly when he entered. Not a full stop, just enough of a pause to remind him he wasn't forgotten, but not forgiven either. In the locker room, his nameplate had been removed. No one admitted who did it, no one needed to. On the empty metal slot where it used to sit, someone had etched a question into the paint with a key. What did you see? Travis stared at it for a long time. He changed in silence, hung his uniform carefully and buttoned the top clasp like it still mattered, then sat on the bench for longer than he realized, unsure if he was waiting for instructions or judgment. Neither came. He walked back to the car with his badge in his pocket, not clipped, because after everything that had been said and not said, he finally understood. Some uniforms can be worn, but others have to be earned, and he had never really known the difference. And now he never would forget it. Later that week, a sealed envelope arrived at the precinct, addressed to no one, stamped only with a black insignia, 3 stars inside a triangle. Inside, a single slip of paper. No name, no warning, just a sentence typed in monospace font, centered and unadorned. Some ranks are invisible until crossed. There was no return address, no signature, but everyone knew who it came from. And no one dared say her name out loud, because some silence remains classified, permanently. Weeks passed. Travis still wore the uniform, but it no longer fit. Not the body, his posture. People noticed. His salute had lost its snap. His voice and roll call no longer carried weight. He led no briefings, requested none. His station never stripped his title, but the walls had, quietly, thoroughly, without a memo or motion. He applied for transfer. He stopped asking. The photograph that had once hung above his desk, his academic graduation, was gone, replaced by nothing, not even dust. One morning, he caught a young recruit staring at the space. When their eyes met, the recruit didn't look away, just nodded once, not in respect, but in understanding. I see what you lost, and I know who you lost it to. In the break room, someone had taped a note near the coffee maker. Typed, simple, unclaimed. It read, "Silence does not forget. It remembers you perfectly." Travis read it every morning, and every time he poured his coffee a little slower, because the worst punishment was never handed down. It was lived in, worn like a name no longer called, but never removed. And so he stayed, not to serve, but to remember what silence cost him, and what it had spared her from saying. There was no ceremony, no speech, no salute, just the letter, left quietly on the edge of a worn oak table in the center of the memorial hall. Folded once, no envelope, no seal. It bore no insignia, no name, only the quiet gravity of white paper resting atop a dark wood grain that had seen too many goodbyes and too few justices. The janitor found it first, but didn't open it. He simply stood, stared, and radioed his supervisor. Within hours, the room was empty, but the paper remained, untouched. By noon, someone had taken a photo. By sunset, the words had ignited across the digital sky. If I speak, someone will have to kneel before the truth, but I stay silent, so they must face their conscience. No signature, no attribution. But everyone knew whose hand had written it. It was her silence, again, but this time written in ink. The line spread like wildfire, first among servicemen, then students, then civil networks of all kinds. It wasn't anger that made it viral. It was recognition. People who had been silenced, overlooked, dismissed, they saw in that line not just power withheld, but power transformed. The phrase was printed, screen-printed, painted, and tattooed. It appeared overnight in unexpected places, taped inside school lockers, projected onto courthouse steps, scrawled in chalk outside recruiting offices. No protest needed to shout it. The sentence said everything. Inside military academies, cadets began passing it along in notebooks, whispering it before lights out. At one West Coast base, a flight instructor paused mid-briefing to read it aloud, then stood in silence for a full minute. In a library in Atlanta, it was framed between volumes on ethics and leadership. The librarians didn't post it, the students did. No one claimed the phrase, but no one challenged it either, because some words don't echo, they land, and Patterson's silence had become a language of its own. The letter had traveled far, but it was the silence that carried further. When Patterson refused the interview, she didn't explain. She simply looked at the young man standing outside the Veterans Hall with his mic half raised and eyes too wide to hide their ambition. Her answer wasn't cruel, it was quiet. A nod that said, "Not now." He didn't press, not because he was afraid, but because he understood that some doors aren't closed. They're waiting to be earned. His name was Eli Branson, 24. Graduate student, journalism, grew up in a town where parades outnumbered protests. His pitch had been clean, respectful, and factual, but it wasn't enough. Patterson's silence wasn't passive, it was precise. So Eli went home, but the story didn't end, because the story didn't belong to Patterson anymore. That night, his grandfather, Walt Branson, found him pacing in the garage. A man of few words, Walt had served in the 101st during WIR. He'd buried more friends than he'd bragged about. When Eli explained the rejection, Walt didn't shrug. He asked for a chair, a phone, and then he spoke. "I fought the Nazis face to face, but I've never once seen this country point a gun at someone wearing its uniform with honor, until now," he said at once. No script, no retakes. Eli uploaded it raw, and it broke the internet clean in half. The clip didn't go viral because of production or provocation. It was a 75-year-old man staring into a handheld camera with the kind of steady grief that only comes from disappointment, not rage. He didn't cry, he didn't name names, but he didn't have to. People recognized the truth when it didn't try to sell itself. Within hours, the video was translated into 7 languages. By morning, news anchors quoted him without context, just the sentence, "I've never once seen this country point a gun at someone wearing its uniform with honor." The statement became something else. Not just commentary, but indictment, reverberation, a line so clean it carved across generations like a fault line. Finally exposed. The silence had lasted 13 days. Then the file surfaced. Not leaked, not stolen, but exposed through a procedural audit gone wrong. A junior analyst cross-referring the command hierarchy found a gap, not a blank, an intentional deletion. Clearance redacted, service years blacked out. The operation is named Black Hole, and at the center of it, a code name that hadn't been referenced since the last congressional closed-door session. Sable Torch. It was Patterson. She hadn't just served. She had been embedded in a counterintelligence directive run directly under the Department of Justice. Her identity had been masked under protective concealment protocols. Her records buried beneath 12 layers of firewall clearance. She was not invisible. She had been made invisible by design. Her presence at the funeral wasn't an anomaly. It was a calculated reappearance from the edge of strategic silence. A week later, the Pentagon received a formal inquiry from the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, citing the incident as an unprecedented domestic breach involving a Tier 0 protected operative. The phrase Tier 0 had never been spoken in public. Now it was everywhere. A memo marked "Strict Eyes Only" from the Inspector General's office confirmed it. Patterson was one of 12 operational assets classified under strategic pivot entities, individuals designated as critical to the nation's real-time defense posture. 12 names. Only 5 confirmed alive. 1 had just been held at gunpoint, and the country was just beginning to understand what it had nearly destroyed. The revelation didn't spark a debate. It ruptured a mirror. 3 nights after the strategic pivot entity memo was exposed, a network aired a segment that wasn't part of its scheduled programming. No anchor introduced it, no theme music softened it. It began with silence and stayed there. Black screen. Then a single line of white text faded in. "America does not see color until the uniform is navy." Then came the faces. One by one, frame by frame, veterans, Black, Asian, Latino, women, indigenous, hands weathered, medals worn not for decoration but for memory. No one spoke. They simply stepped into frame, held up a piece of paper, and left. I served. I bled. I obeyed. She led. No music played. Just the hum of room tone and the breath of people who had carried silence longer than most carried flags. For 12 minutes, America sat still. The screen cuts to a single image, a Black veteran in full-dress blues, late 70s, folding a funeral flag with trembling hands. He walked to a local government building in Louisiana, placed it gently on the receptionist counter, and walked out. No words, no protest, no commentary. Just a folded truth, laid where bureaucracy pretends history has no weight. The screen faded to black, but the silence didn't lift. It carried, through living rooms, through ranks, through inboxes of men like Travis Colburn. By the time the segment aired, he had already been suspended without a public statement. No press, no rally, just absence. The badge had been taken from his desk drawer, the nameplate was removed, and still, no one had asked him to leave. That was the worst part. It meant they had already made peace with the space he no longer filled. He came to the cemetery before dawn, not because it was quiet, but because it was honest. Gray light bled through clouds heavy with unspoken weight. His uniform wasn't pressed, his boots weren't polished. He wasn't there to perform. At the edge of the Patterson family plot, he knelt. Not quickly, not dramatically, but like a man who understood there was nothing beneath him now that hadn't once stood above him. The headstone was simple, military standard. The name is engraved in silence. He pulled the sheriff's pin from his jacket. It resisted for a second, then let go. He placed it gently on the cool granite, beside the corner of the base. Then came the pistol, unloaded, safety on. He laid it across the top like a relic, not an offering. Then he whispered, "I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm asking you to keep silent one more time." He didn't look for a sign. He didn't wait for the wind. He simply stood, slower now, shoulders heavier than his weapon had ever made him. Patterson was standing 10 feet behind him. No uniform, no command, just presence. Their eyes met. She said nothing, not a twitch of her brow, no nod. She simply watched, and then, slowly, she turned and walked away. On the headstone, a folded piece of paper remained. Its handwriting is sharp, controlled, undeniably his. I don't represent America, but I disrespected it. No applause, no redemption, just gravity, and what a man becomes when silence no longer protects him. The silence Patterson left behind didn't echo, it settled, like dust across memory. A month later, at Fort Bragg, a quiet exhibit opened under a name that said everything without explanation. 3 stars, 1 bloodline. There were no guided tours, no banners, just a hallway of light and shadow, where each photograph told more than it showed. First was a grainy, black and white image of a man waist-deep in the surf of Normandy. Rifle lifted above the tide, face turned away from the caption only read, "Grandfather, 1944. Next, a sun-bleached print, Vietnam era, a young officer crouching near a village wall. Eyes sharp beneath the brim of his helmet, one hand steadying a radio, the other holding a child's wrist like it mattered. Father, 1969. Then, at the center, framed in triple glass and backlit like stained glass, Patterson stood alone in a dust storm, desert goggles in one hand, her other hand saluting toward a direction not seen in frame. The angle caught the 3 stars on her collar like they'd been etched by the wind itself. Daughter, 2011. There were no speeches, just footsteps on tile. Near the end of the gallery, a child paused, 6, maybe 7 years old, blonde, curious. He stared at the photo of Patterson in the sand for a long time, then tugged his mother's sleeve and asked the only question that mattered. Why did someone point a gun at her if she's a soldier, like them? The mother didn't answer. Not because she didn't know, but because nothing she could say would sound right inside a room this full of truth. On the last wall, where exhibits usually end with donor plaques or patriotic quotes, there was only one sentence, engraved into brushed steel, illuminated by a single white light. Skin can be targeted, honor cannot. And no one spoke as they left, because some exhibits aren't meant to be remembered. They're meant to be carried. When the images from Fort Bragg reached Capitol Hill, they did not stir hearts. They stirred consequences. Silence had traveled through culture, through grief, through memory. Now it has reached the Senate. The chamber was full, cameras mounted like rifles on balconies. The hearing was billed as procedural, but no one believed that. The subtext was war. A war not over soldiers or foreign threats, but over the very mechanics of who gets to be seen, heard, protected, or ignored. Senator Mallory from Georgia leaned forward, slow and deliberate, and said, "This isn't about an officer drawing his weapon. It's about a system that built his instinct to do so." Senator Kern from Wyoming shot back, "This is overreach. We're dissecting one man's bad decision as if it's a constitutional fault line." Mallory didn't flinch. "Because it is." Documents were waived, footage played, witnesses called. No one dared say Patterson's name directly. It was too loaded, too pure. They said the incident, the officer, and the general. They debated statutes, codes, police training, and command structure, but none of it moved the room until one voice from the gallery interrupted protocol. She was elderly, civilian, not scheduled to speak. She stood with difficulty, holding a faded service photo in one hand, and asked calmly, "How many more times will a person of color have to stay silent just so someone white can feel safe?" No one responded, because in that moment the hearing ended not by gavel, but by guilt. The hearing had ended in silence, but at Arlington, silence was language. Rows of chairs had been set before the tomb, every seat occupied, every soul still. No music played, no speeches filled the air, just the weight of ceremony. Heavy as armor, precise as grief. The National Memorial had gathered not just to honor a fallen soldier, but to witness the woman he raised finish something only she could complete. Patterson stepped forward when her name was called, though none had spoken it aloud in weeks. She wore no insignia, no medals, just navy blue cloth, sharply pressed, hands empty. In front of her, the podium stood ready for a list of names. Her unit, her brothers, her dead. She looked at the microphone, then passed it. She did not speak. She simply picked up the list and began reading. One name, then another. A pause between each, wide as a battlefield. Her voice was calm, even, unemotional, but every syllable landed like a footstep returning home after too many years at war. When she reached the final name, she did not say his title. She did not say father. She said the name. Then she stepped away from the podium. The casket waited, draped in the flag that had once flown above chaos and come home folded. She approached, arms steady, and began to fold the cloth. Not rushed, not for show. The motion was so practiced it looked holy, each crease crisp, each corner tucked with a reverence that could not be faked. When the last triangle was set, she turned, faced the crowd, and raised her hand in salute. It was the first time since the weapon had been drawn on her that she stood fully exposed before a crowd and held the ground with no one's permission but her own. Across from her, a white-haired general stood. He did not salute back. He bowed his head and walked away. A week after the flag was folded and the ceremony ended without applause, something began across the nation. Not with noise, but with code. Quietly, almost surgically, a line of text appeared at the top of every major government website. The FBI, the Department of Justice, the Pentagon, the Veterans Affairs portal, even local precincts in counties no one had heard of. It wasn't accompanied by an update log or a press release. There were no red banners or flashing alerts, just a sentence, centered in black and white, like a scar across the screen. Do not judge rank by race, or you'll find yourself saluting regret. No name followed. No department claimed authorship. It didn't have to. Across every office, classroom, briefing room, and inbox, people read it and understood. Some clicked refresh. It didn't go away. Some filed internal queries. No answer returned. And some simply stared, knowing exactly where it came from. There was no memo from Patterson, no televised statement, no memoirs ghostwritten, no profile in any Sunday magazine. Her silence remained unbroken, not out of retreat, but because it no longer needed to speak. The sentence was her voice now, sharp, final, and inescapably public. Within days, the phrase was printed onto military training materials, etched into the first slide of orientation decks for law enforcement ethics, and posted in black vinyl above chalkboards in leadership academies. It wasn't required, but no one dared take it down. To question it wasn't disrespectful, it was self-exposure. Everyone knew who it was meant for, and what it meant about them if they flinched. In the weeks that followed, some institutions tried to replace it with softer language. None succeeded. Cadets reposted it. Civilian employees screen-printed it on stickers. Librarians printed bookmarks with it. A sheriff in Arizona attempted to publicly reject the banner. By morning, the front of his office had been covered in handwritten copies, taped silently to glass and brick. Still, Pattison never replied, never appeared, never posted. But her absence was not withdrawal, it was elevation. Her silence didn't recede, it hovered, and like all things above reach, it cast a shadow longer than any speech could ever stretch. Because a warning doesn't need to shout when it lands like a verdict. Because sometimes the loudest bell never rings.